Many people have been convicted of a crime that they did not commit, and due to the circumstances that they faced, there wasn't enough evidence to prove their innocence, which isn't in their favor at all. However, like Lockhарт's theory that there isn't such thing as no evidence, I too believe in that. There is no such thing as no evidence because once you're in a place, you'll automatically leave something behind, such as like a hair could fall down or like you might sneeze, resulting in saliva being sprayed over somewhere. Modern day technology has helped scientists discover ways on how to use DNA to relate it back to the person it originally belongs to. There are two different methods in how we can use DNA to prove who it belongs to. Firstly, there is restriction fragment length polymorphism and short tandem repeats. Restriction fragment length polymorphism is also known as RFLP, which was discovered in 1984. And since then, it has helped people be exonerated from crimes they were actually convicted of. Short tandem repeats has been discovered only recently and has been used in crime scene investigation. Restriction fragment length polymorphism is the use of restriction endonuclease enzyme that cuts the DNA strand into different lengths. This is useful for crime scene analysis because each person has a unique DNA. The restriction enzyme particularly separates the strands at certain patterns of DNA codes. The varying DNA lengths are separated by jet electrophoresis. RFLP was used back in the day before short tandem repeats was discovered. Its advantages was that it could exonerate an innocent person who was convicted of something that did not do. But the problem was that in order to use this method, forensics needed a lot of undamaged DNA to prove one's innocence. But that wasn't always the case since DNA isn't always provided in heaps or in perfect condition. Short tandem repeats is another way that can help exonerate an innocent person from jail. Short tandem repeats is a method that determines an individual's DNA by counting the number of times a small DNA sequence is repeated at a specific chromosome region. Unlike RFLP, short tandem repeats does not need large samples of DNA, meaning that it does not need a lot of DNA to be used to determine who it belongs to, because the method could be applied with a smaller sample of DNA. Along with short tandem repeats, polymerase chain reaction comes along. This method enables scientists to enlarge their small sample of DNA, which make copies of the DNA, generating as many DNA as needed. Meaning that the forensic scientist could have one strand of hair that has the DNA needed, and polymerase chain reactions can make as much as they need. For all this to actually make sense and have a conclusion, CODIS is needed since CODIS is basically like a database that has all DNAs, but not DNAs of normal people, but people who were actually convicted before of something, and criminals. They have their DNA and their fingerprints that could relate back and could be like the same DNA they actually found from RFLP or STR. One person who is thankful to these methods and creations by the scientists is George Allen Jr., since he was convicted of a crime that he did not commit and was released and was basically exonerated because of the DNA findings. On the evening of February 4th, 1982, the naked body of 31-year-old Mary Bell was found stabbed to death next to her bed in her own apartment. She had been sexually assaulted, and the bloody knife was found wrapped in a towel and stuffed in a cooler inside of a closet near the front door. George Allen Jr. was convicted of this crime. He was also convicted of rape, sexual assault, burglary, and unlawful entry. Police said that a friend, Pamela Ann Richardson, had called her that morning and said she would come by the apartment. Richardson told the police that Belle said she had just gotten out of the shower and was putting on her robe. When Richardson arrived, no one answered the door and she left. The CSI team found the blood on the floor and had been stabbed 19 times. There was biological evidence on Belle's robe. The initial suspect was Kirk Eaton because he recently had been released from prison after serving time for a rape conviction. He had been seen near the apartment complex where Mary lived, and his brother lived in the same complex as Mary. Short after the murder, Eaton disappeared, which aroused suspicion to the case. About a month later, on March 14th, police officers saw 26-year-old George Allen Jr. He was a diagnosed schizophrenic walking several blocks from Mary Bell's residence and stopped him because they thought he resembled Kirk Eaton. He was taken to the police station where an officer in the police sex offences division interviewed him. During questioning, he said he had previously forced women to have sex with him and then denied it. He then said he had committed rapes in the projects near where Bell lived and then denied it. The officer felt Allen was unreliable and was unstable, so she ended the interview. The arresting officers also contacted Herbert Riley, the detective in the homicide division who was investigating the Mary Bell murder. Riley began questioning and interrogating Allen and ultimately recorded the statement during Allen confessing to the crime. Allen told Riley during the interrogation that he was mentally ill and he was intoxicated at the time of the interrogation and that he was innocent. But due to the unstable state that Allen is innocent, he is also a diagnosed schizophrenic. His word cannot be taken as a full statement. What caused suspicion and could have been Allen's loophole was because during the murder, Allen lived in University City, Missouri, and which was 10 miles away from Mary's apartment. During that time, St. Louis, where Mary actually lived, was digging itself out of a 20-inch snowstorm that paralyzed the city, and police were never able to explain how Allen could have made his way to Bill's apartment. According to the testimonies given, Allen provided police with two details that they did not know about before the interrogation. Allen said that while he was in Bell's apartment, someone banged on the front door and called the name Sherry or something, and he thought it was a neighbor because he heard the door open and close. Earlier, her friend, Pamela Richardson, said that when she came to the apartment as she had promised, she knocked on the door and heard muffled bumping sounds inside. She said she called out her name, Mary, 2 or 3 times and left when no one answered. Chandra Saleh, a neighbor who lived next to Bell, testified that sometime after 10 a.m. she heard screams from Bell's apartment. After the screams stopped, she heard knocks on the door. When she opened, she saw a woman, presumably Richardson, leaving. A forensic analyst testified that Allen could not be eliminated as a suspect based on blood tests performed on evidence. The forensic scientist testified that the only antigen recovered from seminal fluid at the scene were A and H antigens, which could not exclude Allen as the source of the semen. There was no other physical evidence linking Allen to the crime. A fingerprint examiner testified that 27 fingerprints had been recovered from the home. 19 of the prints belonged to Mary's live-in boyfriend who discovered the dead body. The other belonged to a police officer at the crime scene. The other 7 were of no value because they could not be compared to other prints. Investigating Allen's case. The Innocence Project initially closed Allen's case in 1997 because the state claimed the biological evidence had been destroyed. In 2002, after the exoneration of Larry Johnson based on biological evidence that the state had also previously claimed was destroyed, a family advocate contacted the Innocence Project in the hope that the biological evidence in Allen's case could be also located. The Innocence Project reopened the case and located the evidence. In 2003, DNA tests performed on Belle's robe and a pair of jeans found near her body concluded that Alan was not the source of the semen and provided the victim's boyfriend was the source. In September 2012, lawyers for the Innocence Project and Brian Cave filed a motion for a new trial for Allen, citing the DNA evidence as well as newly discovered evidence that the police had failed to disclose to the prosecution or Allen's defense prior to his trials. The laboratory documents show that police actually found semen samples from two different men on Belle's robe. Neither Allen nor the victim's boyfriend or husband could be excluded as a source of one of these semen samples, and DNA tests now show it was from Belle's boyfriend, yet there was also a second semen donor found on the victim's robe, and the B blood antigens in that semen stain excluded Allen and the victim's consensual sex partner as a source. After looking at the entire crime, I thought that they wrongly convicted Allen and that it was not fair since they already knew that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, since that means that this person he's unstable, so that's unfair to him. But when we finally see that he was cleared and was proved innocent, I thought that was them fixing their own mistake by releasing him. So we have the DNA findings to thank that for. So